Today, I would like to go through and prove that God does indeed exist. I consider this a foundational message, and it's one of the things I would like to make sure that we get back to, these roots, get back to basics, make sure that we have this on the website, and that these are, again, fundamental building blocks of our pursuit and our goals in terms of learning what the Bible has to say. And from the very beginning, you have to prove that there is a God. But how do you do that? And then, following on from that, you have to prove that the Bible is His Word. And then you can start getting into it. Once you have those two out the way, though, then you can take the Word of God at face value and begin to see what God has indeed designed for us. So today, I don't want to quote unquote try to use the Bible too much. And again, we have a target market, and I'm even speaking from personal experience in terms of whenever I first started attending church, is that we started, in the middle of the Old Testament somewhere. And again, we didn't really start, that's where I came into, and that's where the sermon was going. But my feeling, my thoughts at that time is that, okay, as a youngster, it would have been helpful to prove some of these things. Because how is it that, when somebody comes to you and says, there is no God, and this is what science does, and they come in, they throw in a lot of stuff, and everybody always thinks of scientists as being really very smart, and because they're really good with numbers and words that we don't understand. But we will break that down over the course of today and see just how we can deal with that and deal with these situations and not have to necessarily refer back to the Bible. Now, of course, what we're going to do is support these statements. It is a Sabbath, and we do want to jump into the Bible. But I also want to give you the ammunition so that you can give an answer for the hope that lies within you. So I don't want you to have to be concerned that whenever somebody comes up and says there is no God, that you'll have the ammunition, the tools, whatever you want to call it, to actually talk to them and to ask them questions. All right. And so also, as we go through this, and I'll try to bring it out, let's not be put off. We know, again, as a Christian, that there is a God. All right. And as we move forward, again, we can rest assured so that whenever perhaps we're confronted with some technical things, we can take a certain amount of solace in the fact that we can stand on that and know that this is the case. And we'll try to point out some of the things as we go along. What I don't necessarily want this to be today is an evolution type speech, or necessarily trying to deal with everything in terms of science. I want to look at some basic proofs of how we can know that God does indeed exist. And hopefully, as we go on, we'll keep on building on these things in later messages. And we'll also get to the point where I think that we'll see even more proofs of God once we can lay these foundations and we know that they are true, that we can then go ahead and, in that sense, not put the cart before the horse. Now, of course, 1 Thessalonians 5:21 says, test all things, prove all things, which is what we have to do and what we need to do. We want to have faith, but we don't want to have a blind faith. And God doesn't ask us to do that. In fact, well, I'll save that for the end. But let's look at, and I'll have, I think, 7 proofs today. And what I want you to do is to take from them whichever one speaks to you. You'll see as we go through, and to me, to a very large degree, all of them speak to me and show that there is indeed a God. So I want you, though, to, whatever it is about some of these, and you don't have to have all 7, because if you can prove that God is, or that God exists from just one of them, you don't have to have these others. But I wanted to give us all these, abilities, all these ways, all these possibilities to do this when the occasion arises. All right, so the first point, creation requires a creator. A very simple concept. We'll be using a little bit of logic today. Again, we always try to use logic, but again, this is the way that we go about proving that God does indeed exist. And this creation requiring a creator is the basis for the first four demands that we will investigate today. And I think it's probably the the main point, the main proof that we have that there is a God. And you'll see how all the others are interconnected with this as well. Now, I think it stands to reason that the universe had a beginning and that it did not come from nothing. All right, this is a very basic principle, and and I'm going to call on a lot of my basic understanding of science, and I hopefully not to nerd out too much on all this stuff, but the fact remains that there were some principles that we learned in school, in college, wherever, about how at that time science understood things, right? And one of the things that science understood was that something doesn't come from nothing. Something always comes from something else. There's this conservation of matter or energy, right? So it's always the same. When you add it all up, is that something doesn't come from nothing. It all comes from something. So, as some others have said it, nothing comes from nothing, right? Nothing comes from nothing. So if we were to say, for example, that, oh yeah, I got this, phone, and it just appeared out of nowhere. It's a Samsung S9 Plus with all the features and everything. And it's, no, this just appeared out of nowhere. You would be literally ridiculed, especially if you put it in some type of context of religion. Then the science community would call you, a crazy, a quack, somebody who does not have the intelligence required to understand the things that they understand. And so even they say something comes from something. They'll admit it, that yeah, everything comes from something, yet this is not what science would have us believe. Science says that the universe came from nothing, okay, is one of the things that they put forward. Now, here's the other thing that we need to understand too, is that as these different, say, arguments or proofs have been put forward, is that science continues to come up with other quote unquote reasons why that's not true. So they may have started off and said, okay, yeah, the universe came from nothing. I confronted a person who said he was a scientist, and I said, well, where did the universe come from? And they came, and he goes back, well, it was this, that. I go, but before that, where did the stuff come from? Because, right, you say that everything has to come from something. This is one of your own rules of science. And he goes, well, it all came from the gases that were there before. And again, you have to say, well, where did the gases come from? Right? And so you keep going back. So they have to admit, and they had admitted, and here's the problem, is that some of them don't admit that anymore. And we'll address that in just a second. They start coming up with different things, and it becomes, in many respects, even crazier, and it contradicts the things that they've said, and the things that they believe, and the things that they have taught over the past. But they have, okay, say in my lifetime, or the way I was taught, they said that it came from, there's a definite starting point. We can actually figure out the beginning, the origin of the universe, all the way back to this single point in time. In fact, we can go almost all the way back to when it began, but we come up just a little bit short of knowing exactly what happens. And then they begin to describe what happened from that point forward. They can't tell you what happened on the other side. Now, some of them are saying that, okay, well, here's what happened. There were laws already in force in the universe before all these things started happening. You go, well, okay, we'll address that in just a second, but that was something, wasn't it? It's not nothing. And then one of the I would say one of the more recent, in the span of time of the universe, is the fact that the universe was always here. They say, okay, yeah, it's been eternal. It's always been here. And this is what they turn to when all the other arguments don't work. And again, that one doesn't work because you have to say, where does that come from? You can't say that it's eternal or everlasting or endless, because there's problems with that, such as, okay, well, if everything's deteriorating, if the sun's going to run out in 5 billion years and the way that everything's expanding, the universe is going to collapse, or it's going to freeze, or it's going to rip or crunch or bounce. They have all these other theories of what could happen here in another 5 billion years. It means that it's not going to exist. So if the universe has always existed, then it wouldn't exist anymore, because all the time has already run out in terms of these things happening. If it only existed 5 billion years ago, then we would know, and that these things wouldn't have happened. So there's all kinds of problems in terms of the logic that they have. But it comes down to the most simple of proofs, is that we understand this is scientific law even today, that something has to come from something. If we have a universe, then it had to come from somewhere else. It had to be created if we can see this creation, if we're a part of it. There is nothing today that happens that does not come from something else. As much as they're going to tell you, as much as they're going to try, and they're going to try to bamboozle you, they're going to say, "Oh yeah, we have this theory of this, that, and the other thing," and it actually is, you can have something from nothing. But no, it's a theory that they have not proven, that they have not seen in work. And at the end of the day, that requires faith to believe that something comes from nothing. We don't know, we haven't seen it, but we're hoping to find it. Then all of a sudden, what becomes the difference between the faith that we have and the faith that they have? Well, as we'll see, the main difference between the faith that we have and the faith that they have is that it takes less faith to believe what we believe than what they do. Psalms 8 verses 3 through 4. These are, I think, condemning scriptures of people who believe or who do not believe in God. Psalm 8 verses 3 and 4. Psalm chapter 8 verses 3 and 4. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you visit him? Have we looked up into the skies and seen the creation and been awed by it? Again, it makes you ask other questions, but again, we have to see our own smallness. We have to see what it is that by perspective and comparison, what we are in the grand scheme of things. In Psalm 19 and verse 1, it says, Psalm 19 verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Again, if we have eyes to see, then we will see this creation, and we'll see the handiwork of God in it. It will make us ask other questions. And it's not only just the heavens, but it shows everywhere, shows his handiwork. And then finally, just Romans 1, verses 18 through 22. Again, these are guiding principles. Okay, these are words in the Bible that we can use to support the things that we're saying and the things that we will be saying. Romans 1, verses 18 through 22. It says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness, all unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Again, we can be talking about scientists who see these things but refuse to acknowledge these things, because what may be known of God is manifest in them. Right? So the things that God has created, it show the magnificence of God. They show a God. And God has given this to us. And there's the only conclusion that we can come to, as we'll continue to see. For since the creation of the world, since the world was created, and we all know that it had a beginning, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things which are made. We get to understand that there is a God, and we get to understand more about God and about his plan and about what he's doing for mankind by the things that he has made, that he's shown, that he's written, he's told us about. Even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Okay, professing to be wise, they became as fools. They looked at these things and they've seen them, and they refused to see God in them. Now, not all of them. Again, science has its place, and it comes up to a certain point where it's still handy, beneficial for us, and it has been in the past, but it also has its problems. So there are those, though, and I'll say this, that there are scientists who have been atheists their whole life, but then when confronted with the ever-growing body of knowledge that we're coming to see and the things that we're coming to understand in terms of the creation, in terms of man, the world we live on, the universe, that they have no other choice but to see God's hand in it, to believe that there's a God, to believe that there's a creator of the creation. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their own thoughts, and foolish hearts were darkened. So professing to be wise, they became fools. So there are none so blind as those who refuse to see, especially those who refuse to see the invisible. Now, a corollary to this, and something you can throw in there, is that when we create, all right, we do not create something superior to us. All right, we create things typically inferior to us. Okay, and I hope that we can see and understand that and not get caught up in these little nuances or the extremities of the corollary. But we create whatever, a cake. We make a cake that's not equal to us. I mean, it's way, way below us. I mean, it's below plant life, and then comes insect and animal and the upper primate type of life. But then you get to man. These are all different planes. We cannot create anything on a plane above us. Okay? We cannot create an angel. We cannot create God, right? And it stands to reason that, okay, there's only so much that we can even do below us, right? In terms of what we can create, right? And we'll get to that in probably the next point. But the point is that, we have not created anything superior to ourselves. It's not the way things work. You're not going to find, a plant that creates an insect, or an insect that creates a mammal, or a mammal that creates a person. It does not work that way. It cannot work that way. We have never seen that. Right? And so, again, we need to consider that in terms of this thing. And I just put it there as a corollary that if we could create, it won't be upwards, and it won't be, as we'll see here in this next part, not even really on our own level. So point number 2 is that life requires a life giver. Life requires a life giver. Very simple concept, and one that, again, science has recognized continually, time and time again. And so, of course, because they have to recognize this, they have to make up excuses for why it's not true. So life comes from life. Life begets life. That's how we have all been sustained and how the world has continued to work. Man has a law, and it's called biogenesis, which means that life comes from life. Life starts with life. Now, so what do they want to say? They want to say, well, there's abiogenesis, right? That means that life comes from something inorganic or inanimate. So, okay, we got to throw this in there so that we can still account for there being no God, because we have to prove that there is no God. Otherwise, we're getting very close to proving that there is a God. But there is no concrete evidence of this natural abiogenesis, this life from inorganic things. Now, I only bring that up because we're not even there. We're not even to the point of being able to produce life from in an abiogenesis method from inorganic or inanimate objects. We're even further away from producing life from nothing. We can't even produce it from something. I mean, God did that, right? He created everything from nothing, but then he also created man from some dirt. We can't do that. We can't create dirt. We can't create anything from dirt. Now, don't be fooled with these little bitty incremental things that they say that they're doing, like they're splicing genes into another living organism, or they're starting off with yeast, and we know a lot of the properties of yeast and how it wants to multiply, etc., that man is still trying to do, is trying to create, quote unquote, some life. But it is not self-sustaining, is not something that can be replicated, is not something that happens, but yet they want you to believe it happens, but it doesn't. It's life from life. So after all their trying and all their failing, they're willing to say, okay, it will happen someday. But again, what does that mean? It means that they're taking it on faith that this will happen, that this is going to happen. So after these, 6,000 years of mankind, and man has, quote unquote, gotten smarter and understood the things around him better and better, that again, this is as close as he can get. And yet they teach, and we know that life comes from life. Now, here's something else too to consider, is that say we get to the point where we can create another human being, okay, not something above us. Okay, let me rephrase that now that I think about it. Of course, we can create other human beings, right? We that's what we've been doing for the last 6,000 years. Mankind has been simply doing that in the method that God has designed. But say outside of that, scientist says, okay, I'm going to take this and I'm going to make this human, right? There's still this incredible gulf, this incredible chasm. I mean, not that they're ever going to get close to that they have to cross. And we find that in Job 32 and verse 8. Job 32 and verse 8. And this is what differentiates man from animals. Right? So if man was able to create something, okay, I don't even think they're going to be able to create animals or anything of any substance ever. But say they do get to that point. Here's the big problem that they have, is that Job 32:8 says, but there is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding. So we see that man and what man has become, and what man is when we compare him to the animal world, which again we readily acknowledge to be the next nearest living creature to us. It shows any amount of what we call intelligence. It, again, is these primates, and they're so far, from where we are that it's laughable that there still has to be this spirit in man. Okay, this ability, and this is what they can't account for. Science wants to say that man is a collection of chemicals and elements, and now we understand that there's this neuron pathway in the brain, and this is the way that things work in there, and yet what they don't understand and can't understand is that the understanding comes from God. The ability to be like we are, to be creative, intelligent creatures, comes from God. It's, as he says, the breath of the Almighty gives understanding. But there is this spirit in man that gives him the understanding of men. And 1 Corinthians 2 talks about that as well. So we do know, though, what the truth is, and if you want a supporting scriptures, it's Genesis 2:7. It says, God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into him to his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. So again, there's so much more to that, and we're so far beyond, where man is and what man thinks can be done, that it's, again, like I said, it's laughable. And in the end, the proof is that life comes from life, and there's no other way, right? And so someone, again, that was beyond what we are had to create us. Now, the third point is that laws require a lawgiver. Laws require a lawgiver. Again, this is a very simple point in many respects. And I think we'd understand that, well, where do your laws come from? The laws that we live by. Well, we have a lawmaking body, and they said, okay, here, we're giving this law to you people, and you need to follow it. Well, the laws of nature, which is more or less what we're talking about here, are and have been intact as far as we can figure out. And as I was alluding to before, they want to say in one of their, again, explanations of how the universe came to be, that the laws were there before these things happened. So these laws, which again have no physical, say, manifestation to them in terms of they're the rules that govern things, but they're saying that, well, when everything exploded, these laws then actually jumped into place, and they were the ones that actually then caused everything to happen in the way that it was supposed to happen. Now, of course, when we say that laws require a lawgiver, that laws don't just happen, again, it has to go hand in hand with what we're saying in terms about creation, is that creation just doesn't happen. There is a creator. There has to be a creator. It demands a creator. And by the fact that there are laws that are in effect, it demands that there be a lawgiver. And what we have found is that these laws are the same everywhere. In fact, if they were not in existence, then there would not be a universe. So there are these laws that, again, were put into place by what? Again, you have to fill in the blank. And it's obvious that it was God who created these laws of physics, okay? The laws that they used to figure out how far and how old the universe is, and what happened all the way back to this, tiny fraction of a second after, quote unquote, everything went big bang. Again, I'm sure that they're going to, because that one has been what has happened and how it's just fallen straight into the hands of the Christians. They're going to come up with something else, and they will continue this. The scientific community, the naysayer, the atheist, the agnostic, whoever is going to say, yeah, whatever they're going to try to say. But at the end of the day, laws require a lawgiver. Now, the science, like I was saying before, is going to tell you that something can come from nothing, provided that there were laws of nature that were already there, right? Which, again, if you ask me, that is something. Even if it's intangible, it still is something. And so you have to ask, where do the laws come from? So what we have is, quote unquote, these laws or these forces that pre-existed the universe, right? And what we have to understand too is that even the laws that we have, or our understanding of them, whether it's, say, quantum mechanics on one side or theory of relativity on the other, quantum mechanics describes the small things, right, like atoms, all right? Relativity is about the big things like the universe, the planets, and things like that. Well, those two don't come together. You can't use one to describe the other, which to me tells me that there's some problem, and they're trying to come up with this grand unified theory of how these two operate together. And what's the binding force, because all these things exist. Okay, if you're looking at the hydrogen atom, then you got to go, okay, well, it's out there in space. Okay, it's the fuel of, say, the sun. Then you got to go, okay, or helium or whatever. So you got to say, well, okay, how does that marry up then with all the other things that we know? And man has reverse engineered all these things. This reverse engineered is their ability to describe how these things happen. Okay, and they've figured out a lot of things, but they won't say they figured out everything, or it's just a matter of time. But what we have then is, okay, let me see if I've described it good enough. We have, and you have to tell me what this describes, okay? These laws, quote unquote, are forces that existed before the physical creation that are non-physical in nature, but interacts in the physical way to create the universe. What does that describe? What is man describing here when he says these things? When he says that these laws existed before the physical creation, they're non-physical forces, and it interacts though with the physical to create the universe. Does that not describe God whenever we talk about this? I mean, how is it that God did that? God was this unseen force outside of space and time. Of course, you have to be outside of these things that you're creating to create it, okay, these forces. And you have to then, when everything, quote unquote, went big bang, that you are able to work with them in such a way to create the universe. And to me, it seems like science has described God. So rather than some nebulous kind of shot in the dark that takes faith because they don't even know what happened at the Big Bang, much less before the Big Bang, to me, this all points to an intelligent lawgiver. Laws require a lawgiver. James 4 and verse 12. James 4 and verse 12. And of course, the Bible supports this. There is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. So again, there is one lawgiver that has put everything into motion. So whether we're trying to describe the physical or whether we're trying to describe the spiritual principles that we live by, it is God who ordained these things. It is God who put them in motion as this creator that is superior in every way to anything that we can even understand. Now, point number 4 is a design requires a designer. A design requires a designer. So if you see a design, okay, perhaps if you're a seamstress, or we can go back to the cake analogy, if you see that and that it was, okay, purposely laid out in a certain way, then you're going to have to assume that there is a designer. It's only logical to conclude that the designs that we see in creation require and demand that there be a designer. So when we look at, again, this creation, we look at humans, for example, and you look at how we are designed, right? And say, let's do one thing, like the human eye. Right? You look at the human eye and how complex it is. What we need to understand is that with all the complexities, and if you've ever looked at the eye and how it works, and the fact that it even goes backwards onto your retina in terms of, and upside down, I should say, and then your brain flips it over, is just, again, beyond that. I mean, I would never design it that way, but the cones, the iris, the pupil, the macula, everything that all works together is just so complex that it actually, if you took away some of these parts, would not work. So this whole theory that the eye evolved cannot be true. The eye only works like it is right now. Right? If it was less than what it was, if it was just, I don't know, some globe in your forehead, then according to evolution and according to nature, it was useless and we're going to get rid of it. So there's no way that an eye could evolve except for an eye to happen in all of its complexity, which again is against evolution. Evolution says you start from a very small single cell organism, very simple, and you move towards complexity. So whenever you have the I, it's like, well, you can't have anything less than I. So in that respect, it disproves evolution because it can't evolve. It has to be created exactly like it is. And you can look at other examples in nature in terms of the bee and the flower. It's like the bee can't live without the flower, and the flower can't live without the bee. How do they evolve if they both need each other fully to exist? So again, you don't have this progression. You have this instantaneous creation, and we see a design, a working in things. I was reading an article about proteins and DNA. Again, I don't even fully understand it in terms of the way that DNAs create protein and proteins have to communicate, and proteins have no real intelligence, yet they can communicate everything that they need to communicate. Okay, it's like, again, there's this codependence between the two, and they're both so complex and intricate that, again, you can't get there in steps. To me, one of the other ones about the design of DNA, and again, we're still trying to figure out things, okay, as science, right? We're trying to figure out what is DNA, and we thought that DNA was, again, the quote unquote building blocks of society, of I say society, of a human, that's what it is. But what we're finding out is that DNA is like the cover of a book. So when you go read a book, how much importance do you place on the cover? Right? The cover is just something to contain all the information. So what they've found is that even below the DNA, which is already super complex, there's something that's beyond complex, and that they can't even fathom or start to begin to understand. And for anybody to believe that this has just happened by by fiat, right? Then it's, again, you ignore the probable, you ignore the obvious. So it's, what we're seeing here then is all these things that had to come together, and the odds of them coming together, if you want to talk about probability, are beyond astronomical. If I recall, the number of atoms in the whole universe is like 10 to the 69th power, somewhere around there. And then you go, okay, the odds of just some of the things that have happened on Earth that we've calculated, just one of the things was 10 to the 180th power that this could possibly happen, which is so far beyond 10 to the, say, 70th power, right? And again, it boggles the mind if you truly understand these powers of 10 as they go and they reach out. And that's just one thing. But you have to take things in the way probability works is you multiply the probability of this happening times the probability of this happening. So if this was only, this is only 10 to the 50th power, well, you have to multiply that times 10 to the 180th, and you get 10 to the 230th power. But that's only two things. You take all of these things and you start happening, and you're going, this couldn't happen by chance if there's that many atoms, only that many atoms, okay, by comparison and for perspective, in the universe. And so what we're seeing is a purposeful design. We see that, and we saw that, say, in the humans, and we're just barely touching. And I highly recommend, whenever you have time, not that we all have those times, but if you ever want to make the time, there's just an absolute ton of information out there that shows the designs of the universe. And so we looked at humans, but let's look at the environment around us, the design of the environment. When I say that, I mean it in the broadest scope of things, right? So if we look at the Earth, okay, you see the tilt of the Earth, you see the rotational period of the Earth, the gravity, even the shininess of the atmosphere. If any one of these things, or any one of a number of other things in the Earth, was off by just a little bit, life on Earth would not exist. The moon is the exact distance it needs to be away for the tides to work. We need tides to continually move the water so that it actually does not stagnate, and so that life can exist. If there was too much of a pull, if the moon was closer, it would flood the land. So it's precise in terms of where it's exactly at. Even the salinity of the salt, or the water, the salt in the water, keeps the water from freezing and turning us into an ice age. And the list goes on and on and on. You look at the sun and the way that, again, the distance we are from the sun allows us to actually have water in three states. Is a solid, a liquid, and a vapor or a gas. So if it was any closer, we would heat up too much, things would dry out, nothing would live. And the same would be if we got too far away, it'd be too cold and everything would freeze. And this is, again, among other things, the type of sun that we have. If it was too red or too blue, photosynthesis would not work. The sun's magnetic field is perfectly aligned so that we are protected from the cosmic rays. All of these things, they call it the anthropic principle, all of these things show how finely tuned the universe is for us. There was a design in these things so that intelligent life could exist and prosper. Without all of these things being exactly the way they are, this life would not happen. So what we have then is what? Is this just an odds? Again, we've already talked about. Now we got to add more odds. What are the odds that these things would happen? Now, something I found fascinating, and this is about as nerdy as I'll go, and it might be too much. I'll move through it pretty quickly. But all the laws of nature have particular constants associated with them. There are things like the gravitational constant, the speed of light, the electric charge, the mass of an electron, or something like Planck's constant. Maybe we heard about that in high school or college. Now, Planck's constant is 6.62607,004 times 10 to the negative 34th joule seconds. Okay, well, you look at that and you go, wow, that's very arbitrary, isn't it? Those kind of numbers that just happen. Well, science up to this point have described 26 of these constants that describe the universe. Of course, there was a point when there was 25 and when they thought that that was all. But now it's 26 and they still don't know everything that they need. Now, here's the interesting thing, is that while these values all seem arbitrary, all right, and let's take Planck's constant, if it was changed and some of these other constants were changed, a universe would still exist, but it would not support life. So these seemingly arbitrary numbers are not nearly as arbitrary as they sound. So, for instance, if gravity was different, okay, if the gravitational constant, which determines the strength of gravity, if it was, say, lower, stars would not actually even shine. Okay, if it was higher, stars would burn too fast. So the gravitational constant has to be the same for the universe to exist the way it is. Right? And all of these things, all these constants that all seem arbitrary, all have this very small window of vacillation, as it were. If they vacillated, some only 1%, others 5%, the universe would not exist as it does and would not be capable of sustaining life. So these things, again, while seemingly arbitrary, are definitely not. And I was going to show you how different the number. If I took 5% off of the Planck's number, right, and I showed it to you, and you looked at it, and it's 33 zeros, and then 62947,665, you're going, okay, 33 zeros, then that number. Okay, how does that compare with the number I gave you before? Again, the mind boggles if you even remember that other number because it's so just out there. But the numbers don't vary that much, and yet the whole universe would not exist the way it does. And if you looked at how it would exist, you're going, is that really a universe? In some cases, only hydrogen would exist. Only a single cell or single proton element. That's it. So you look at these things and you're going, to me, that shows design. That shows God's hand in it. How finely tuned the universe and all that there is in it is for just us. We would not exist if everything was not exactly the way it is. And the odds of that happening are so ridiculous that, again, you'd have to be a fool to not see God in it. So Psalm 139, verse 14, I can turn there real quick for you. It says, I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. As a Christian, my hope is that you can see some of these things and you can see just how God's thumbprint is all over all of these things. And whether it's how we are made, okay, how wonderful it is that we are made, and how extremely complicated we are, to even the world around us. So I think to say that there is an intelligent design and intelligent designer is an understatement. The next point is fulfilled prophecy. Now, again, this touches kind of on the Bible per se. I wasn't going to go to the Bible per se, but again, this is not only a proof of, I think, God, but a proof of the Bible as well, is the fact that the Bible can say things, and then outside of the Bible, all these forces have to come into agreement for prophecy to come to pass. And we'll probably touch on this a little bit more in the future. But for example, the prophecies of Daniel. All right, so Daniel has the image of Daniel. When you start to understand what it is, and God even said, or through Daniel says, okay, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, you are the head. There will be these successive Gentile world ruling empires that will come up after you. And you can see that these are all documented. And God even says in another prophecy about 400 years before the time, he says, okay, yes, Cyrus, you're going to be the ruler of one of them. And you're going, okay, 400 years, that's outside the scope of any man in terms of the life to make sure that this happens, to make sure that these happen. And knowing man's going to try to not make these happen just to prove that, there is no God, or I can alter the plans of God, or whatever man tries to conjure up in his mind. So what we have, though, is with the prophecies of Daniel, is that it extends an even longer time from the time of Daniel, right, which was the time of Babylon. So we're putting it around 500 plus years before Christ, all the way up until now. So we're talking almost 2,500 years that this prophecy has been going on and is continuing to be fulfilled. How outside of there being a God who is in control of the affairs of man can prophecy be fulfilled? Again, it's something that people will say, this didn't happen. Well, again, what I have found too in going through a lot of these things in terms of science is that they say, oh, that's not true, or science has already proved this, or that can't happen. Well, they say these things, but they do not offer proof. Again, they need to offer proof, which they do not offer. And yet, here is the proof. So there are, again, if you wanted to look at just the prophecies concerning Jesus, and that Jesus did come, and that just Jesus fulfilled all these prophecies about him, which were at least 300, of which 60 were major. Some people put it as 456 prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. And some of those, say that somebody wanted to try to fulfill them, some of them could not even be fulfilled by a human if they wanted to try, showing the hand of God in it. And again, we have a message about that, about the prophecies about Jesus Christ, and we'll post that in this. The next point is answered prayer. So number 6 is answered prayer. Again, now, like I said before, any one of these things can be a proof to you. It's something that you can say to others. Now, the answered prayer is not one that people are going to readily believe. They say, oh, that's just time and chance and these things happen. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but I think each of us know, and there's a lot of things been documented by people who we know and trust, as well as, things that, like I said, have happened in our own lives, things that we've prayed for that are undeniable. Now, one of the things we have to, and I'll say this for the naysayer, is that one, God will answer all the prayers of a Christian, right? Now, the answer is not always yes, all right? So a lot of times it's no. So is he answering all your prayers? Yeah, well, the 99 that you ask, yeah, or that are not in accordance to his will, is not the things that you need, yeah, he's going to say no to those. Any parent who has had a child who has incessantly asked them for things, right? And you have, how many times you have to say no? It doesn't mean you're not there. It doesn't mean that you don't care. It doesn't mean that you don't understand. But nonetheless, the answer is still no. And then there's the answer of yes that happens from time to time. And we can see God's hand in those. And so, again, those are too many and sometimes too ethereal to for the average, say, scientist to kind of put his finger on. But nonetheless, it's something that God can use, and can even use it in the life of somebody like that, to call them and to bring them to this way of life. And finally, point number 7 is a way of life that works. Right? And when you look at what has happened throughout the history of man, and all that man has tried to come up with, right? And all that man has said, this is the way. Okay, whether it's a form of government or a type of philosophy, they do not work. They have not worked. I think most people would like to see peace. Okay, so let's assume that we're all on that page, and that peace for all mankind is a goal of all these religions, or not religions, but governments and philosophies. The thing is, none of them have ever achieved that. None of them have ever been able to achieve it, because it's outside the scope of what the Bible says is right. So what we're getting back to then is that there is a God who put these laws into motion, who created the universe, okay, and designed a way, and set these things such as life in motion, that, okay, this is the way things are going to work. This is the way things, how they work. And he gave us this an instruction manual. And that instruction manual says, if you live by this, then it will work. Now, what we have to do, obviously, is separate the word from the person to a certain degree, because as people, we will always come up short, and we fail, and we come short. And people will take that to say, oh, look, that way of life does not work. Well, we have been able to see it to a great enough degree that it does work, and that this is a way of life that we want to be a part of, and that if it was enacted on a global scale, mankind would be happy, they'd be peace, they'd be prosperous, and the list goes on basically ad infinitum. But man, he has a way that seems right to him, and he keeps coming up with different ways, and none of those ways work. So again, if you have lived this way of life and you see how it works, and when I say that, I mean things like, okay, the fact that you shouldn't steal, right? You see that, okay, if I keep that, then everything's better, right? I don't go to jail. I don't cause hurt and pain to my brother. There's peace between us, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think, in a very small example, but when we look at living by everyone, everybody benefits and everything works better. And Christ said that in John 10:10, he says, I have come that they may have life, and that they may have it more abundantly. I mean, this has been one of the main motivating factors behind why we have the Word of God. And I might say this too, I'll throw this in too. It's kind of a peculiar way to look at it, but who in their right mind would put together the Bible for a God, for a false God? That's not the way that we would think, or the way that we act, or the way that we would go forward, right? Because in the Bible, God says, okay, I want you to do this. I want you to walk this straight and narrow path. I want you to, go do the hard things. I want you to have these trials and tribulations. Who says that? Who says, okay, I'm going to write a way that, okay, it's easy. It's like pizza for everybody every day. We get to do whatever we want. We get to eat as much candy. We get to have all the things. That's the God that I would design. Of course, that's without any type of forethought or what's trying to be accomplished. But the thing is, why would we design this Bible with all that we have to go through and all that we have to suffer in this life, as the way that we need to live. And again, it's one of those things that I thought was, kind of quirky when I thought of it. That yeah, I said that's not the Bible I would design. So we have the Bible that God designed, one that does lead to life more abundantly, and that's the kind of God that we have. And to me, it's like if we look at it, and people don't understand the Bible because they haven't delved into it, they don't have the mind that it takes to go into it, and because of that, they come up short. And you'll see this in a lot of the arguments that are out there, that they don't take everything into account, and so yeah, again, they come to the wrong conclusions. So obviously, we're to live by every word of God, Matthew 4:4, Luke 4:4. And if we do that, then we will have this life more abundantly. Things will work out. And again, we see God. And I'm trying not to get too far ahead of myself, but when you look at the Bible and what it says and you live by it, to me that points back to a God. It's a way of life that works. If everybody said, okay, we're going to throw the Bible away and just live these ways, then again, it would be a perfect way, a better way, and everybody would benefit from it, unlike everything else that has been described or happened throughout the history of man. So when we look at this, and you look at these, and all this that we have, all this proof that's in front of us, and like I said, I think even one of them is enough to prove that there is a God. But we have that, and then we have the science behind it to prove it, and we have the examples and the experience to prove it. That, to me, it's no doubt that to believe in anything else takes more faith, because science has to hope that they're going to find something, and then when they find that, they'll have the evidence of things that they never saw. Okay? And that's the exact biblical definition of faith, is that they needed, and they tried to tell you that these things happen, that they're so sure. As a 50-year-old, they try to tell you something that happened 13.8 billion years ago, and they try to say it with a surety. But at the end of the day, it does not prove, okay, that there is no God. In fact, it's just the obvious opposite, is that whenever they start putting forth everything that they see, just how wonderfully everything is made, and how precise it is fine-tuned, and how they cannot replicate the things that they want, and how much of their argument is missing, then, to me, you have to come to the conclusion that there's a God. If you don't, it's this willful ignorance, it's this willful blindness that people are willing to have, and it is a blind faith that they are living. So, of course, brethren, as we continue to move forward, we're going to see that, okay, yeah, there is a certain amount of faith. But again, we can, and I'll speak personally, is that I don't think it takes much faith at all to believe that there's a God now, because I've seen so many things and proved so many things that it's true. Let's turn to Hebrews 4, verse 2 and 3. Hebrews 4, verses 2 and 3. And we'll see what part of the problem is. For indeed the gospel was preached to us as well as to them, but the word which they heard, the words that we're speaking today, the words from the Bible, the words that they heard did not profit them. Sound familiar? Not being mixed with faith in those who heard it. So again, there is a certain amount of faith that it does take, especially more so in the beginning, to believe these things and to see these things, because at the end of the day, yeah, we weren't there either, but we can start putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. For if we who have believed do enter that rest, as he has said, so I swear my wrath that they shall not enter my rest, speaking of the Israelites, that they were not able to go into the promised land, but he's saying that we will. although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. Again, the works, you know, God created, he sustains, he finished all these works. The works are not happening, they're not still happening. The universe is still not being created, and we're not creating new lives and new forms and evolving. It says all that was done when I did my creation. Okay, in the 6 days that he recreated life on the earth. So turn over to Hebrews 11, verse 3 for one final verse. A few chapters over, Hebrews 11 and verse 3. Again, is this lack of faith that they have that we should not have. We should have faith, because by faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God. So if we believe that there is a God, and then we'll get to believing the Bible is his word, then we understand how the worlds were made, how the universe came into being, how humans were created. We understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. Again, it was made by the invisible. It's not things that we do. So to me, you know, when we look at all the evidence and we take these simple truths, these simple logical statements, then we can come to no other conclusion that God does indeed exist.